Hygiene in the Old West was about what you'd expect, which is to say, practically non-existent. People who made their way west across the continent contended with harsh terrain and often harsher weather. Survival was the #1 concern, and finding a nice spot to bathe just couldn't be much of a priority. Today, we're going to take a look at what hygiene was like in the Wild West. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other Wild West topics you would like to hear about. Nah, quit your fussing, because we're gonna get knobby on the necessaries. Dust was everywhere in the Wild West, and heavy winds and dust storms were common. They would send clouds of dirt and grime into homes and businesses alike, while threatening the lives of both settlers and their livestock. According to one Sarah Raymond Herndon, a young girl who made the journey from Missouri to the Montana Territory in the late 1860s, the dust along the trail was almost knee-deep in some places. On one occasion, after walking 20 miles in one day, her party camped for the night. Sarah observed that the boys' faces were covered in so much dirt, one could just see the apertures where eyes, nose, and mouth were through the dust. Being that the Wild West was wild, many people just relieved themselves in the woods. However, outhouses were also a common part of frontier life. Typically built close to houses and homesteads for reason of safety and convenience, the average outhouse was just a hole with a wooden structure erected above it. When the hole filled up, it was covered with dirt, and then the wooden structure would be resituated over a new hole, typically dug nearby. Outhouses, as you probably imagined, were not pleasant smelling, and people would often try to mask the foul odors with lime or lye. Bugs were commonly found inside outhouses, including flies and black widow spiders, the latter of which tended to bite people as they sat down to do their business. Have fun thinking about that next time you visit the loo. Modern toilet paper didn't exist yet, so people had to use whatever was available. This often included leaves, grass, and corn cobs. Youch! That's a real painful clean. While not all beds in the American West were made from hay and straw, most were. This being the case, the bedding material wasn't changed often, which typically led to infestations by lice and other things you probably wouldn't want to share your bed with. Known as seam squirrels, such infestations made sleeping less than hygienic. And if that isn't bad enough, flies commonly found their way into foodstuffs and human waste, and poorly insulated buildings were usually swimming in mosquitoes. Screens on windows were rare, so bugs could follow people from their homes to the outhouses and back, carrying with them particles of anything they'd pick up along the way. Surviving in the Wild West meant having a supply of clean water, and it wasn't always easy. Homesteaders would often build outhouses that would leak into the ground and contaminate the water for those who lived downstream from them, something that wasn't always known by the people who used the water. Rain would often be collected in cisterns, but that had its own issues. Dust and other contaminants were easily mixed in. Making the problem worse was that stagnant water would attract flies and other insects that would leave waste and excrement behind as they hovered over the water. In the interest of preserving the water they did have, people would often refrain from washing clothes or dishes. If they did clean such household goods, it would often be with used bath water. Speaking of which, when it came to bathing, entire families would often reuse the same tub of water over and over again for a week, sometimes even longer. There's nothing better than ending a long, hard day's work than sitting back and relaxing in a warm tub of family filth. Dirty family bathwater stew. Frank Clifford was an associate of Billy the Kid, who was also known to go by the names John Menem Whiteman and John Francis Wallace. Clifford wrote a memoir about his time in the American West that is notable for providing details of the soapweed Mexican women used to wash their hair. Made from the yucca plant, soapweed left the hair soft and clean and lustrous. And Clifford said he used it many times himself. Those who didn't favor soapweed made soap from animal fat, which was harsh and was known to cause skin irritation. Luckily, there wasn't much of an emphasis on washing. Body odor was just considered a natural part of life. In fact, it was widely believed that too much cleanliness endangered one's health by opening the pores to germs and diseases, so people had little motivation to bathe. Frank Clifford may have washed his hair with soapweed, but there were other forms of shampoo available. For example, whiskey. Yep, some cowboys were so tough, they literally had their hair done by Jim Beam. But as it turns out, whiskey had many uses in the Wild West, including everything from disinfecting to pain relief. When mixed with lavender and castor oil, it made for a fairly effective shampoo that was rinsed with rainwater or water softened with borax. As for the women, after a good brushing or combing, they would often curl their hair using heated pencils. Spit was a thing back in the Wild West. First off, the bars in most saloons had a rail or series of hooks that held towels patrons would use to wash excess beer foam off of their mouths. Hygiene not being much of a priority, the towels weren't washed between uses by different people, so they passed saliva from one patron to the next and aided in the spread of germs and diseases. But an even greater problem was that chewing tobacco was incredibly popular. The fronts of bars were also typically lined with spittoons and cuspidors for those who wanted to spit. The spit would be covered in sawdust, which seems like a common-sense way to dry it out, but it didn't actually work that well. Diseases like pneumonia and tuberculosis ran rampant. Moreover, the sawdust itself became a breeding ground for germs, and since saloons often rented their floors to weary travelers, people would actually sleep right on the diseased muck. Things got so bad, some municipalities were moved to try and curb the excessive spitting or outright ban the practice. Spitting on train platforms and in train stations was made illegal and was punishable by a $500 fine, a year in prison, or maybe even both. Being a cowboy in the Wild West usually meant spending long days out on the range without bathing. For most cowboys, soldiers, and other men, their lack of cleanliness would only be interrupted by the occasional dip in a local river or stream. For obvious reasons, this was usually done during the warmer months, which meant that in winter, most guys just skipped bathing altogether. Women, on the other hand, were usually a little better. Emphasis on a little. They would typically wash their hands and faces in the morning. However, a lack of privacy, coupled with the average Western woman's sense of modesty, usually prevented much more than that. When it came to laundry, men usually went longer periods without washing their clothes as well. When they did bother, clothes were usually just rinsed in a river, stream, or whatever the closest water source was. Laundry, plumbing, and dishwashing in the Old West were usually accomplished with water that was also used for drinking, so it was very common for diseases to break out at camps and settlements. Cholera, for example, was both common and deadly, often ending the lives of settlers and Native Americans alike. In the 19th century, a series of cholera outbreaks among the Mormons claimed untold thousands of lives. The Mormons saw it as punishment from God and a test of their faith. At the same time, the disease was spreading from overland trails to tribal communities, where it was wiping out large numbers of natives. In 1873, there were cholera outbreaks in at least 18 states and territories. These outbreaks were often used as excuses to scapegoat unpopular communities. Such was the case in the Dakota Territory, where Russian immigrants were blamed by some from the medical community for bringing cholera to the territorial capital at Yankton. One doctor described the Russians as lower-class peasants who were filthy in their persons and their habits. They were blamed for the outbreak, though, and of course, it was actually part of a much larger epidemic. It's important to note that the hygiene practices in the Old West weren't monolithic. Different people from different cultures often took very different approaches to cleanliness and grooming. For example, while Westerns favored the straight razor for shaving, not everyone followed suit. Archaeological evidence found at Deadwood, South Dakota in 2005 supports the idea that the large population of Chinese immigrants who lived and worked there didn't shave at all. Rather, they would use tweezers to pluck their hairs out one by one. Ow, 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 ow. When visiting a town, your average cowboy was likely to treat themselves to a haircut, shave, and maybe, if they were feeling extravagant, some scented hair tonic. Like 80s glam rock stars, some of the most well-known figures from the Wild West wore their hair long. Among those with luxurious locks were James Butler Hickok, aka Wild Bill, as well as the notorious General George Armstrong Custer. Custer is even said to have scented his hair with cinnamon oil. The trends would turn back to shorter hair in the late 19th century. Tooth care in the Old West was a relatively primitive affair. Toothbrushes were uncommon. People would frequently use their knives to pick out food from between their teeth, and some stagecoach stops and public establishments would offer community toothbrushes. No thanks, I'll pass. If a tooth became problematic, it would usually just be pulled. Despite the existence of famous gunslinging dentist John Henry Doc Holliday, oral care professionals were incredibly rare. Those who needed a tooth pulled usually turned to barbers or blacksmiths, who would remove the sore tooth with tools that were basically fancy pliers. No anesthetic was used, but for pain management, patients were prone to taking a shot of whiskey, or 2, or maybe 3. Make that 4. So what do you think? How long would your modern-day sensibilities last in the Wild West? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.